Hello and welcome back to our podcast here at Manor Park Classics. And today we're going to discuss the cars of Roy Haynes, designer at Ford, later British Leyland, who in the late 60s and early 70s designed some of the most popular and certainly interesting cars in the British motor industry. But he wasn't around at the top of the motor industry for all that long, and so I think his name is often forgotten. But today, as we so often do, you and I, we're going to go down a trail of often forgotten automotive history. So when cars come into our purpose-built facility here, I always like to find connections between them. So a few weeks ago, you and I were talking with Tim, who was sat to my left here, and we discussed how he was going to bring in his Mini 1275 GT for our February auction. And I'm very pleased to say that this little Mini is here. Unfortunately, it's parked behind a Toyota Hilux, so I can't quite see it from my seating position, but we have a Mini 1275 GT, a very interesting and certainly very cool car in its own right. But only in the last few days, it's been joined by an Austin Maxi, which is just see the rear quarter of behind this wall here to my left. But having been joined by an Austin Maxi, we have two Roy Haynes designed cars. And over previous auctions, over previous months and even years, we've had quite a lot of Mark II Ford Cortinas. And the Mark II Cortina is probably Roy Haynes' best work. So I think it's a good excuse, having had these cars come through our auction here, to have a chat about the man and talk about what he did. And in spite of his relatively short tenure at the top of the British motor industry, to talk about his legacy as well. So Roy Haynes came to prominence in the 1960s, by which point he was already in his 40s, when he was working on the Mark IV Ford Zephyr and Zodiac, followed by the Mark II Cortina. Now, I believe, though I might be slightly mistaken on this, he was part of a wider team that did the Mark IV Zephyr and the Zodiac, its more upmarket counterpart, but he led the Mark II Cortina project. And now those two cars at Ford in the 1960s, Ford was growing in Great Britain in the 1960s. Ford had really hit a stride by the beginning of the 60s with cars like the Anglia and the Mark I Cortina. They had struck a chord within the British buying public, and people really wanted to be seen in a Ford now in a way they just hadn't previously. So in the 1950s, Ford built some very austere cars. The Anglia, the Popular, for example, they were all very affordable, economy-focused cars. But when the 105e Anglia came in 1959, it fundamentally changed Ford's image. Now, sure, the Anglia dated very, very quickly, but it was Ford sticking their heels in the ground and saying, we are here and we're going to do something different. We are going to build ourselves up to eventually compete with and beat the almighty juggernaut of, albeit the faltering juggernaut by this point, of BMC, the British Motor Corporation. So I want to concentrate on the Mark II Cortina. And by the time the Mark II Cortina was launched, therefore, Ford were really rising. And in 1967, the first full year of production for the Mark II Cortina, it briefly became Britain's best-selling car. It was the single kink in the armour of BMC's Austin and Morris 1100, the 1 year within its mainstream production run that it didn't go on to become Britain's most popular car of the year. It was the Mark II Cortina. So could we kind of attribute some of Ford's growing success to Roy Haynes? Well, I certainly think we can, because the Mark II Cortina looked very different to the Mark I Cortina, but it also looked much more timeless. Everything about it was very simple, very clean lines, a very squared-off appearance, for sure. But it wasn't a boring, boxy car. The Mark II Cortina was full of very delicate detailing, of very sophisticated shapes that, although it looked very simple in profile, was also very pleasing to behold, and certainly to a lot of people, a lot of average consumers in Britain in the late 1960s, the Mark II Ford Cortina was the car to be seen in. The Mark II Cortina was also quite a classless car. So when we're discussing cars that become classless, we talk about things like the Mini, for example. Total cliches within automotive history, but I'd like to bring the Mark II Cortina into that discussion as well. because being such a popular fleet car, so popular with vast swathes of the population, the Mark II Cortina was everything to everyone, no matter where you were in a corporate ladder. All of Ford's different trim levels and the different attributes that the Mark II Cortina's inherently perfect shape could then inhabit. So it could have the luxury pushed upon it by the Cortina 1600E, for example, or it could look very lowly, it could look very basic. The simplicity in its lines, in the general shape, meant that it was very versatile to Ford from a marketing perspective. And though it was only on sale for 4 years, I think it did a lot for Ford's image and really propelled the Cortina in a way we don't really remember. We remember the Mark I Cortina as it was the first. But the Mark II Cortina is the first one that became a bestseller. And the Mark II Cortina helped propel the image of the Cortina to the point where the Mark III Cortina, which was launched in 1970, could then go on and cement its position as Britain's best-selling car. But Ford in the late 1960s didn't only have this Mark II Cortina and, of course, the Ford Escort, launched in 1968, but they also had the likes of the Capri. The Mark I Capri, the original. And these cars, taken in profile altogether, show Ford embracing what the public wanted in terms of style. Now, regardless of how these cars were propelled, what these cars looked like mechanically, Ford's cars of the late 60s were eminently desirable. And a lot of that is down to the simplicity that was instilled upon them by Roy Haynes. So look at the old Anglia 105E, look in a slightly lesser extent at the Mark I Cortina, and certainly look at the likes of the Ford Corsair from the 1960s. They were all good-looking cars in their own right, but they were all quite fussy, and so they dated very quickly. And though, as I said, the Mark II Cortina was only on sale for about 4 years, I think it easily could have been on sale for 7, 8, 9 years, and people would not have tired of it. The only reason they felt like replacing it is because people wanted something slightly larger, and so they went to a car with a bigger character, with slightly more interior space, even if it took up about the same amount of space on the road, in the form of the Mark III Cortina, of course. Now, Roy Haynes' cars at Ford, I think, owe a lot to the United States. There's a lot about the Zephyr and the Zodiac that came from the American branch of Ford, and I think that Ford of Great Britain learnt how to design desirable cars from their American counterparts, and then transformed them to meet the goals, the aspirations, the tastes of a British and European audience as well. So I think we see that start to progress. The 105E Anglia was very American in its appearance, but maybe it wasn't quite so suited to British tastes. By the time we get to the Mark II Cortina, it has been simplified down. It has been watered down into this very palatable, very timeless appearance. And so, seeing the challenge that Ford were now presenting towards them, BMC, British Motor Corporation, who very quickly became British Leyland, realised that they were going to be overtaken. They didn't have the money to develop all new models, and they had a great relationship with Pininfarina, who styled many of their cars, but realistically, many of their cars were engineered before they were styled, which is totally in the reverse to how Ford were doing it, and Ford were making huge amounts of money on every single car they sold. BMC were losing money on every single car they sold. And so George Harriman, who was the chairman of BMC at the time, decided that he wanted to go headhunting. He wanted people who were the best in their fields, who had proven success rate, not in the past, but that were successful now. And he was going to bring them to BMC, whatever it took. And so in October 1967, he headhunted Roy Haynes and brought him over to BMC. Now, October 1967 is an interesting time, because that is right in the middle of the London Motor Show of that year. And that says to me that BMC wanted to make a really big deal out of this. They had the press at the time sat as a captive audience, sat there waiting for this news. And so, they all had access to the higher-ups at BMC to interview, to talk about this new designer who's coming to BMC fresh off the launch and the brilliant success of this Mark II Cortina. In fact, George Harriman said to the Daily Express, I think it was, in October 1967, he said, "I want the best men, and I'm prepared to buy them no matter who they work for at present." And that says a lot as well about a changing attitude within BMC, changing for the better, although we all know what came next, that relative failure and eventual nationalisation of British Leyland. But it shows that they, at least at this point, they seemed as though they were no longer set in their ways. They were willing to look at what they'd done, they were willing to realise their faults, and they were willing to take on people who thought in a different way, people who had different aspirations, people who saw the future of the car market in a very different way to those at BMC, engineers, the likes of Sir Alec Izagonis, for example. So Roy Haynes came to BMC in 1967, and he brought with him a team of people that he worked with. They weren't headhunted on their own. Roy Haynes was headhunted by BMC, but he brought with him a band of merry men to help him transform BMC. And one of the figures that we'll get to in a little while was called Harris Mann. Now, Harris Mann later went on to become British Leyland's head stylist, but when he came with Roy Haynes from Ford to BMC at the end of 1967, he described it as a mausoleum. That's the word he used to describe BMC's kind of stylistic developments at that point. And this is in spite of the fact that BMC in the late 1960s were producing some of the most modern family cars in the world. The Austin 1800, for example, didn't have subframes, transverse engine, front-wheel drive, fluid suspension, all that kind of stuff that we go on about forever. But stylistically, they had nothing to go on. The cars were barely styled, if at all, and although the Mini came to be loved and the 1100, styled by Pininfarina, was a very pretty car in its own right, many of their cars were not. The 1800 failing beside the Ford Cortina, partly because it was ill-focused on the task in hand, but also because it was ugly. And so Roy Haynes had come over to instill some of this stylistic magic in a company that had never really had any true stylists working within it for so many years. So Roy Haynes' first task at BMC was not to start designing new cars from scratch, but it was instead to fix the problems that they'd been left with from the previous engineering and stylistic teams that had been there. So, of course, we have the cars that I just mentioned, the Mini, 1100 and 1800, all on sale at that point. The 1100 and 1800 we'll get to in a little while, but I'll first discuss the Mini because we have that Mini 1275 GT in for our auction. We also have a Mini Clubman as well, which is somewhere over out of my vision to the left-hand side. We have a Mini Clubman which has been fitted with a Rover K-Series engine. That's a pretty serious bit of kit that is there. But he was left with these ageing models, these models that were very well received from an engineering perspective, but that were growing to be less popular for various reasons. Mechanically, reliability-wise, people were just more willing to go with the more conservative Fords. But stylistically, as I said, they just weren't there. So when Roy Haynes came to BMC at the end of 1967, the first task at hand was not designing new cars. It was not doing something new, different, radical. It wasn't about bringing a Mark II Cortina to BMC. It was about working with what they had, because BMC had no money. They weren't making any money on any of their cars in the 1960s, and so they had to work with what they had, either in production or on the drawing board. And that brings us to both the Mini Clubman and the Austin Maxi. So, of course, the Mini had been in production since 1959. It was only growing in popularity, really. And indeed, its best year would end up being in 1971. So we're not there yet. We're only in 1967, remember. But the Mini was really starting to age. And journalists, the automotive press generally, were starting to, subtract points from the Mini based on things that weren't being corrected about it. So when the Mark II Mini was launched in 1967, it gained a larger rear window, square rear lamps, a squared-off front grille. But all the problems that the press had complained about, the external door hinges, the sliding windows, the genuinely dangerous door catches, for example, just hadn't been fixed. They had just left all the problems that they knew were in the Mini design and just did a mild facelift around them. It's a really strange atmosphere that Roy Haynes must have been thrust into, but immediately he set about facelifting the Mini, about making it fit for the 1970s because they weren't going to be able to replace the Mini. They didn't have the money, and frankly, they didn't need to, as was proven to be correct in the long run. And so, of course, he engineered that new rectangular front end for the Mini. Very much like that seen on the Mark II Cortina, and we'll get to that point later on in this podcast. But the Mini Clubman was certainly more modern to look at. It certainly refreshed the look of the Mini while retaining everything that was good about it, and he fixed many of the flaws that were within it at that time. We got wind-up windows, for example. We got instruments that were actually in front of the driver instead, which, just we hadn't had before. And so this was all a little bit different, but at the back of the Mini, of course, it still had that saloon body style. And that saloon body style of the Mini was perfectly acceptable in the 1960s. It was only really, in the mid-1970s that it started to look a little bit old-fashioned. But at that point, in about 1967-68, Roy Haynes and his team at BMC started to work on a hatchback version of the Mini. And very interesting that car would have been as well, though it would have been quite a bit longer than the Mini because of the angle they wanted that hatchback to be. They wanted it to be a bit of a fastback style on the back of the Mini, so maybe it wasn't the most practical of things to add if your car is all about being small, but certainly it would have had the versatility of a hatchback had it been launched. In the end, the financial woes of BMC were so poor at this point that they just couldn't do it. They thought facelifting the car was much more important, and so the only, apart from the little bits, like the instruments in front of the driver, the wind-up windows, etc., the only real big stylistic difference to the Mini that Roy Haynes was able to push in was that new rectangular front end. But a much more pressing problem was that of at the moment, yet to be launched Austin Maxi. The Maxi was launched towards the end of 1969. In fact, I think I might have just made a mistake. For some reason, I'm now thinking it might have been April 1969. Someone can correct me in the comments below, but 1969, the Austin Maxi was launched. And when Roy Haynes came to the company, he found a project that, like the 1800 a few years before, had become misguided, had started to totally miss its brief and just not stand up at all to the competition that was coming to them from Ford, that of course Roy Haynes knew ever so well by this point. So the Austin Maxi, of course, was going to be a hatchback and was designed to be a bit of a Cortina competitor. But because BMC insisted on using the same doors as the Austin 1800, a lot of people just thought it was a revised 1800, which of course it wasn't. But Roy Haynes again added that rectangular, much more modern-looking front end to the car, and while the rest of the car at the back was a little bit scruffy, it was quite utilitarian in its concept, but also very frumpy in terms of the entire car's stance. He at least managed to add a much more coherent front end to it. So in those early years at BMC, it seems as though Roy Haynes went around firefighting. He went around taking existing models or existing projects that maybe weren't quite ready yet and just doing what he could with them, doing what he could to make them palatable, at least, relatively palatable at that. But beside the Mini Clubman and the Austin Maxi, there was also a project known as ADO 22 that he worked on. ADO 22 was to be a revised, relaunched version of the Austin & Morris 1100, itself codenamed ADO 16. The Mini, for reference, was ADO 15 and the Mini Clubman was ADO 20, so this was ADO 22. Eventually, ADO 22 was canned and it was replaced with an all-new car, which became the Austin Allegro. But ADO 22, I think, would have been much more successful than the Allegro, because the 1100, as I said, was Britain's most popular car. Apart from 1967, it retained its crown through to the beginning of the 70s, when it was slowly drawn out of production. And so they had a very popular product that they were planning on updating. Certainly, in 1962, when it was launched, the 1100 was probably the most modern small saloon car in the world. And so did they really need to reinvent the wheel? To totally rethink the car and come up with the Allegro? They probably didn't. And so ADO 22 might have been quite a good idea. There are some pictures of ADO 22 floating around the internet, which again, it has quite a Mark II Cortina style front end. Though this time it is a little bit different. It has a much wider, fuller front grille with a big Austin name through the middle of it in a blank section that's a little bit like the Zephyr and Zodiac. Of course, the Zephyr and Zodiac, famously did not have a grille in between the headlamps, which was quite controversial in the late 60s. But ADO 22 had a little bit of that coming into it. It looked a very sophisticated, very modern, very different, but I also think very palatable little car. So it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had that car launched. But as I said previously, Roy Haynes went around firefighting, picking up the inherently decent projects that BMC had on the table. Certainly from an engineering sense, they were very modern, but trying to add a little bit of that acceptability that Ford had and that was growing at Ford in that time period. What Roy Haynes really believed in, however, was the idea of platform sharing. Now, BMC in the 1960s are famous for badge engineering. Just over previous auctions here, we've had, Austin and Morris Minis. We've had Wolseley Hornets, which is the posher version of the Mini. We've had 1100s in here at a few points. And just at the last auction, I had a go in a Riley 472, which is the badge engineered version, the posher badge engineered version of the Austin Cambridge. Those Farina saloons that BMC had in the 1950s and 1960s. And that form of badge engineering is very simple. That is really put a new grille on the front of it, put a new badge on it, maybe a bit of new interior trim, and that's your lot. It is clearly the same car, and within all, sales charts, for example, that all be put down as just BMC Farina. It's the same with the 1100 we just mentioned. You could have had an Austin or Morris 1100, an MG 1100, a Wolseley 1100, a Van der Plas Princess 1100, or a Riley Kestrel. All variations upon the same car. Platform sharing is not badge engineering. Instead, platform sharing is kind of what Volkswagen do today. It's the ability to take one floor pan, to take one general set of engineering hardpoints, and then design almost totally different cars around it. They may share the kind of sunken engineering costs. All the things that you can't see might be the same, but on the surface they appear very different. And on the surface they feel quite different as well. That's the way that Volkswagen today can produce cars like the Volkswagen Touareg, the Porsche Cayenne, the Lamborghini Urus, the Bentley Bentayga, all of which are essentially the same car, but they look and feel very different. And so for the vast majority of consumers, you didn't even know they're the same car. That is platform sharing, and that's what Roy Haynes envisioned for the future of BMC. He saw the proliferation of marques in the newly formed British Leyland by 1968, 1969, and saw, Austin Morris. But you could also have a Wolseley or a Riley, one of the two. You could have a Rover or a Triumph, for example, and if the cars were in the same segment, they could have the same floor pan. They could have vaguely the same suspension setup, but they could be tuned in different ways for different cars. They could all act slightly differently, and they could have different engines as well, and that would make them feel like different cars. Very different from the badge engineering we're all used to. So, in some ways, you could say that Roy Haynes was a visionary. He envisaged a few different platforms, a mini platform, an 1100 platform, a family saloon platform, a Cortina style platform, and then maybe one on the top for the executive cars. 4 platforms across the entirety of British Leyland would have been so much more affordable and so much more achievable and so much easier to productionise than designing a load of new cars on all different platforms at all different times. So our way into that discussion is with a project known as Condor that he worked on in the late 60s again at British Leyland. And Condor was designed to be... It was going to be British Leyland's Ford Capri, or the Opel Manta, or Vauxhall Forenza, whatever you want to look at as a sports-facing, two-door coupe from that kind of time period. And Condor was designed to sit on the platform of the Morris Marina. Now, we'll get to the Marina in a few minutes, as that is undoubtedly Roy Haynes' biggest project at British Leyland, and slightly ill-fated as well if you look at it, compared to how we perceive the Mark II Cortina today. But Condor was designed to be the Ford Capri to the Morris Marina. And that would have been a really interesting car, and it proves the value of platform sharing. People might have known, if they cared enough to know, that the Ford Capri was essentially bits of Escort and bits of Cortina put together on one platform. But instead, it spoke so much more than that. It spoke to what people wanted from a car. It was the car you always promised yourself. And that kind of marketing is an invaluable tool to be able to have a car that that feels very, very different to its more humdrum counterparts. And that's why something like Condor might have done much better than than the Marina is perceived to have done. Now, in some ways, you can say that certain manufacturers at British Leyland were already doing a similar thing. So, of course, the Jaguar E-Type had a lot of mechanical components that it shared with the Jaguar XJ6, which came along later. They didn't share everything, but there's a number of hard points in the suspension, of course, the engines, etc., that these cars did share. And if that was kind of spread out across British Leyland, then profitability could have been so much higher than it actually was in the early 1970s. So you could have had, say, a new Triumph saloon, a new Rover saloon, and a new Jaguar saloon, all of which sat on the same platform but felt very different. This is not a Rover SD1 with bits of Triumph engines in it, or just a badge-engineered version where they all look the same. This is like that modern Volkswagen Group, as I mentioned a few times before. So that brings us then naturally to the Morris Marina. And the reason the Morris Marina existed is because Roy Haynes saw what BMC were doing, saw what British Leyland were doing, and thought it just wasn't worth it. He thought that what they needed was a Ford Cortina competitor to get the fleet markets on side, to get serious volume behind the cars, and to engineer it simply in order to extract the maximum profit from it. That's what Ford were doing with the Cortina after all, and so with bits of Triumph and bits of Morris Minor beneath it, the Marina was a very, very affordable package that was productionised out of old bits really, and was only initially designed to be around for 3-4 years maximum, but with a totally new Roy Haynes designed body. And something I feel is so often overlooked is the fact that the Marina, or my opinion that the Marina, should I say, it was quite a good looking car. Now, we're meant to not like the Marina, and I understand why people don't like the Marina, but the Marina was designed for a purpose, and it filled that purpose perfectly well, and it brought a lot of that much more modern, simple, dignified styling to BMC's small saloon, sitting as it did kind of between Ford's Escort and Cortina. So I imagine that the idea, therefore, was to have these new cars launched, to have the Mini Clubman, ADO 22, and the Maxi, I suppose, so he came rather too late in the day to really affect that design. And then the Marina all would sit together and compete for a few years before eventually they were either radically revised or they were replaced entirely. So, say in 1975, for example, the Morris Marina was replaced by something all new, by the Triumph SD2, for example, which was an ill-fated Marina and Triumph Dolomite replacement. Again, platform sharing. They sit on the same platform, but they're quite different cars on the surface. And so they sit in those two different market segments. They get the sales of both of them, but they don't start to impede on one another. They don't start to overlap in a bad way, as people often say British Leyland cars did of the early 1970s. But in the end, Roy Haynes left British Leyland after only 16 months at the company in 1969. But within those 16 months, he'd done the Mini Clubman, the Maxi, and the Marina. There were 3 cars that he had had, at least a serious look into, although 2 of them were, as I said before, firefighting. He had quite an impact in spite of him only being there for 16 months, and he really changed the course of British Leyland's future, for better or for worse. Only you can decide, really. But some say that he left British Leyland because they moved their design offices up to Longbridge. And now I'm not sure whether that was the case. He denied it at the time and said it was due to personal circumstances, though British Leyland, when they were asked, let on a little bit and said that it was really due to him not willing to relocate to Birmingham. But if that was the case, then from where Roy Haynes lived in the 1960s, for him to commute to Cowley every day was a heck of a commute. So I'm not sure why he left the company. But my guess about why Roy Haynes left British Leyland is because he encountered so much inertia. I know for a fact that there was serious reticence towards the idea of platform sharing. This is a company, remember, that has badge engineered everything for so many years, and yet, having brought forward the idea of platform sharing, they weren't all that enamoured by it. That philosophy of George Harriman in 1967 to bring in Roy Haynes and to say, look, we're willing to look at what other manufacturers do and change our ways and bring in new people to modernise and to further our common goal of building good cars and selling them and making a profit, and everyone's happy. But within only 16 months, that relationship appears to have broken down. So I don't know whether anyone can add anything to that about why Roy Haynes felt he had to leave after only 16 months, but regardless, he did. And his legacy at British Leyland really is who took over. And it was Harris Mann, who I mentioned before, who described BMC as a mausoleum in 1967. Harris Mann immediately took over as a relatively young car designer to lead the department at British Leyland, and he then went radical. He did the Allegro, which was, the Allegro is not what he envisioned it to be. The Allegro was too tall because of certain part sharing that it had to do with other cars, the E-Series engine, heater boxes, etc. But if you look at Harris Mann's original concept for the Allegro, you see that it was a very sleek, very wedge-shaped car. So when you take that concept and you put it in line with what he also did in terms of the Princess and the Triumph TR7, and we see that everything that British Leyland was, for better or for worse, in the 1970s, all the controversy, all the modern avant-garde stuff that they were potentially producing, was all down to the employment of Roy Haynes back in 1967. But that employment of Roy Haynes back in 1967 had a very different outlook to how it ended up being. So we saw with the Mark II Cortina all these very simple, straight lines. We saw brilliant detailing in these cars, yes, but simplicity, timelessness overall. And by the time Harris Mann left British Leyland in the early 1980s, that had all been washed away. All thanks to the fact that Roy Haynes left after only 16 months. So it's a fascinating little bit of automotive history. It's also a bit of a kind of what if. What if Roy Haynes had never come to British Leyland? What if Roy Haynes had stayed on at British Leyland longer than he did? What kind of cars would we have seen? Would he have forced through a Marina replacement in 1974-75 rather than, them having waited until 1984 to replace the Marina, or the Ital as it was by then? It's very interesting just to think about. But when we look at his cars all in profile and we look at all the different kind of things, the shapes that he made, we have to consider that they all look very, very similar. Now, was this a trademark of Roy Haynes? This was something he liked doing. This was his way of putting a kind of a family face on everything so that people would recognise the cars as Austins, in the case of the Mini Clubman, the Austin Maxi, the Morris Marina, or BL cars, really, to recognise them as Leyland cars. If he'd have stayed at Ford, would the Mark III Cortina have looked a little bit different? The cars that came after, would they have all retained a very simple appearance? Was that Roy Haynes' trademark, or was he a bit of a one-trick pony? Now, we don't know, and it's all conjecture anyway, isn't it? But it's just an interesting thing to think about, really, to think about how the fortunes of these huge historic car manufacturers all depend on the individuals that are tasked with designing their cars or tasked with kind of marking out a future, deciding what that future should look like. So it's just a bit of a thought exercise, really, about how one figure who's only there for 16 months can really, change the future of a company as big as British Leyland. So if there are any other car designers that you think have a similar strange relationship with their products, whose vision wasn't entirely realised, and do talk about them below, because it's really interesting to bring these names out, to bring them into the public sphere in a way they might not have been for decades and decades and decades, because otherwise they will just be lost to history. And I think it's always good to remember history as an example of what we've done, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful, and what, therefore, might come out of the future motor industry. So thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of the podcast. It's lovely to have you here, and it's also interesting to do these different little things, to sit and use this forum, really, to discuss things that might not otherwise be discussed. So if you did enjoy it, then click like if you can, depending on how you're viewing/listening to this content. Get in touch with us, leave some comments, and most importantly as well, head over to our website, have a look at the Austin Maxi, have a look at that Mini 1275 GT, and even come and have a look at them for yourself too.